I'm very excited that we have with us again in 2021 Denise Ranger of and founder of Ranger Paralegal Service. They now can be found on Facebook at Ranger Paralegal. Their phone number is 905-240-7529. And their updated website URL is ranger.legal. Welcome, Denise.
Thanks. Well, it's great to be here.
Yes. And when we spoke last week, just sort of prepare for this, I said I saw, I think it was on CP24, that even when a landlord, and we're talking today, guys, about landlord tenant matters. And when I posted this thing last week that we're going to have you on the show, I did get a couple of people saying, I want to see this, tag me in it. And people were giving me some questions to ask. So I will be asking some of those questions to you as well. But back to my little story. So CP24 last week, I saw some commercial where even if the landlord has all the proper documentation, has the proper whatever clauses in their contract, no matter what, they're still on the hook for maintenance of their lawn and snow clearing. Why would that be?
Okay, so in the Residential Tenancies Act, there is a provision that says that you cannot contract out of the act. So that's part of my answer is because the landlord, as the owner of the property, cannot contract out of the Residential Tenancies Act. And the Residential Tenancies Act says that a landlord is ultimately responsible for all maintenance. That's section 20, okay? However, okay, a lot of landlords, let me back up. Landlords are allowed to contract with their tenants for certain services.
Right.
The issue with maintenance, in particular, snow maintenance, lawn maintenance, is that if the tenant is not a professional maintenance person, for example, they're not a landscaper, they don't do snow removal in the wintertime, that's not their normal job, then the question becomes whether or not the tenant has the capacity or the ability, or not, maybe not capacity, but the knowledge. They're not an expert. They're not a contractor. That's not their job, for example, okay? So to contract with this person, if they do a poorly job, if they don't do the job well, then it still falls to the landlord to do it, right? If a landlord wanted to hire a proper maintenance company and the maintenance company didn't do a good job, it still falls to the landlord to actually do the job, do the maintenance. So the problem is that the tenants don't usually have that as one of the things that they do. That's not their vocation. That's not their job. So it's a little bit dicey as to whether or not that kind of side contract basically will hold up in court or hold up at a tribunal. Usually it doesn't.
But if you're the landlord, wouldn't you want to take that on yourself anyway? Because if someone ever slipped and fell on your property, the likelihood that the tenant's going to have insurance to cover it's next to none anyway.
You have hit the nose right on the head. Hit the nail right on the head. That's perfect. And you're absolutely right. So a tenant is not necessarily obligated to carry the same kind of insurance or liability insurance as a landlord would. Some landlords can require a tenant to have tenant's insurance, not just for their own the contents of the unit, for the tenant's personal belongings, but also for liability issues to indemnify the landlord in the event that the tenant does something that causes damage or causes harm. So you're absolutely right, Dan, that a landlord who is looking to limit their liability or limit their risk may not want to enter into that kind of an agreement with a tenant, because at the end of the day, it's still their responsibility. And if you try to put it off onto somebody else that may do a job that's poor or substandard, or that could cause a problem, it's going to come back on the landlord anyway.
Now, is there a way around it though? So let's just say, I work with landlords all the time. So let's just say there you put it in the standard whatever document that we create for the landlord,
Yep.
And let's just say you say, the tenant's responsible for X, Y, and Z maintenance.
Yep.
And the landlord will provide a lawnmower, shovel, salt.
Yep.
Is that a way to mitigate risk for the landlord?
Not necessarily. If the tenant is by vocation, their job, their career is involved in landscaping or snow removal or something of that nature, then you may be able to get away with it because that's normally what the tenant would do anyway. But if the tenant is a baker, a legal person, a realtor, that's not necessarily something that they are going to have knowledge of, other than as sort of general common knowledge.
Right.
So
it makes no sense. Like, I own a home. I think, Dad, do you own your home? When we go outside and clear our driveway, we're not experts. Look at me. I'm barely functioning right now. And if I go outside and clear my driveway, salt it, or mow my lawn, and I don't do it properly, how is my standard as a homeowner different than a standard of someone that's renting a home?
Right.
You know what I mean? It should be equal.
Because you own the home. So if somebody sues you, it's going to go through your insurance.
Correct.
Right. If I slip and you're renting, I'm going to go. Then I'm going after the landlord, and it's really. I mean, you could take off and go wherever you want afterwards.
Right. But okay. So then, how do you get around this?
You don't.
Oh, I can answer. It's very easy, Will. All you have to do is do what we do, and you just hire a property maintenance company to do everything for you, and then you don't have to worry about anything. Exactly.
Dan, that's the perfect way to do it, is just build it into the business or the overhead of running a rental unit. So if normally you would charge, and I'm just going to ballpark it here and keep easy numbers. If normally you would charge $1,000 for your rental unit, then factor in what it would cost to have proper maintenance during the summer for lawn care, proper maintenance in the winter for snow shoveling and driveway, clearing and that kind of stuff. Figure in salt, what, if you go to a company, they're going to give you an estimate of what it's going to cost, or they're going to give you a contract and say, okay, well, this is what we offer for winter for residential homeowners.
Right.
Add that into your rent.
Right. But again, so I see here you're saying, so you hire this company, and then typically with these companies, like I've worked with a couple, I don't know, I think you have as well, Dan, and Denise, you probably talked to a couple of people that have worked with them. Their standard contract for snow clearing, for instance, is that like if there's a snowstorm, they'll come by within X amount of time to clear it. But the snow can accumulate some more. People are walking outside. Again, how does a landlord have the confidence, even if they take the step, that someone will come back on that? Or is this something that this is just, I guess, a price of doing business?
So if a landlord has hired an outside maintenance company for lawn care, for snow removal, and clearing of ice and that kind of thing, then the landlord is automatically mitigating their damages, which will go to offset or help if there is any sort of an accident that might occur, and will help in any defense against any claim, whether it be by the tenant or by some other person that just happens to walk by, that might slip or fall in the area.
Interesting. Here's the thing: if you write clauses in as an agent, and you feel like you're protecting, the landlord, but I guess the advice to real estate agents out there is that if you're working with a landlord, they must work in the cost. And I think the concern primarily would be winter costs. That's the biggest trip and slip hazard liability. The cost of bringing in an outside third-party company to maintain the property during those 4 to 6 months when there is winter weather.
Correct.
Essentially. Correct. Okay. That's good advice. Now let's talk about, because right now what's going on, it seems in the media and the news, that the government has barred, evictions, it seems, correct?
Yes and no. There's a pause on okay.
All right.
However, you can still serve a tenant a notice for eviction. You can
Right.
file a notice, or sorry, file an application at the landlord tenant board. And when I say at
Right.
the board, I don't mean you're physically going to go to a building and hand them the document. You have to do it online, or you have to mail it in, or you have to email it in, depending on the type of application. The landlord tenant board is working really hard to make all of their services accessible online. It's
Right.
slow, just like any other process that involves bureaucracy and that kind of thing. There's a lot of red tape, I'm sure, and training people is making it a little bit slow, but they're working on it. So you can serve a notice, you can file an application. There's hearings being held right now. Actually, as we speak, I know that the board is holding hearings. So they are scheduling matters. The issue is that there was a pretty significant backlog before COVID-19. Now, as a result of COVID-19, the backlog is a little bit longer. But they're still holding hearings. They're still moving the process forward. It's just slow.
Right. So when you said longer, so if I was if I was a landlord and I filed something today,
Mm-hmm.
and there's already a backlog, is there a 4-month, 6-month, 8-month? Wait.
Could be 6.
Wow.
Could be more.
Right.
Could be less. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to give you a direct answer or a more concise answer. I do know that the landlord tenant board is working really hard, and there's a lot of people in the background that are trying to move through the backlog as quickly as possible to get up to date, so that they get to the point where they're actually hearing matters within the 6 to 8 weeks that's in their mandate.
Dan, anything?
Well, you know my thoughts on this, Will.
Let Denise know. Denise wants to get to know you so much better.
Yeah, I don't know if people really do, though. I don't know. Like if I'm a landlord and I have to resolve an issue, to me 6 to 8 weeks is like even that as being the mandate is unacceptable, right? And now if we're in COVID and it's going to take months to hear something, if I got to try to kick somebody out, or I need to collect on rent or whatever it is that I'm doing, like to me that's just utterly ridiculous. And they either need to hire enough people to get in there to be able to clear these things out, or what's the point of having this board in the first place?
Understood. Absolutely understood. It's definitely a difficult time for both for landlords, tenants of course as well, but definitely for especially small landlords.
Right.
I know that they're really feeling the pinch right now. If they've got a tenant who is struggling and not being able to pay the rent or not being able to cover utilities or whatever, I know everybody's struggling, but I understand that landlords, smaller landlords. When I talk about small landlords, I just mean that they're not the big, huge corporate landlords who have hundreds of units in multi high-rise buildings. We're talking about mom and pop or small investors that have maybe 1 or 2 properties, maybe 20 properties, but they're on a smaller scale. I understand that those people are struggling, and there are some mechanisms that are available that are normally are kind of a last resort, but in this current day and age, there's a little bit more focus on them. One of the things is called a cash for keys agreement. And that's basically, I know we wanted to talk about that. I had a talk this morning actually with some realtors.
How did it go?
It went really well. It was a little bit dodgy, and we're going to have to play with some post-production, shall we say, but the presentation itself went really well. We're posting something up on the Facebook page very soon at Ranger Paralegal.
Perfect.
I got to be able to get my plugs in. Come on.
Of course.
So there is that as an option, and that's basically negotiating and mediating between the two parties to see if we can come to an agreement where the tenant agrees to vacate the property. And usually there's some sort of a quid pro quo involved, where the landlord offers something to the tenant of of value that entices the tenant to enter into such an agreement.
Now, is that when a landlord or a tenant will come, instead of going to the landlord tenant board, they'd come to you to sort of maybe work out an arrangement and have a contract in place so that both parties can agree to it?
Correct. So the landlord, typically I'm hired by a landlord who is looking at entering into this type of an agreement, and the agreement is made and presented to the tenant. However, sometimes the tenant gets an agreement presented to them, and they want legal advice on whether or not it's worthwhile taking, and that's also just as important for a tenant, because they could get into, they may end up agreeing to something that really isn't in their favor. And it's important to make sure that you know your legal rights in a situation like that, and that the interests of both parties are balanced.
Right.
See, but
here you go, Dan.
No, but now here's where I have another. This is what I don't understand. If I go to somebody, say I go to Will, and I want to rent his house, and he presents to me a nice little contract, and I write, okay, I agree to rent this house for 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's my end. I'm lucky that I have now found somebody who's going to rent me their house to live in.
Right.
So as long as I'm not a dummy and mess the whole thing up, I should be able to live in that house for a year. That should be the right that I have, as long as I've paid the rent, I haven't thrown any like crazy parties and trashed the place, and everything's good. However, once I don't pay my rent, I don't understand why I should have any legal rights to stay in that property. If Will needs to pay his mortgage and needs that rent to pay the mortgage on the house, he should have every right to give me a month to get caught up, maybe 2 max. And if I can't do it, then he should have the right to be able to remove me right away and bring in somebody else to be able to help pay the rent on that property.
And I understand that, and that makes perfect sense.
Of course it does. And that's why the world is always geared to going to the lowest common denominator, and it always protects the people who aren't holding up their end of the bargain.
Understood. And my answer to that is that the Residential Tenancies Act actually is written to balance the interests and the rights and obligations of both parties. Especially,
does it though? Does it?
How is that balanced if I'm not paying my rent and he's got to pay the mortgage on the house and is getting no rent in from me? To me, that's not balanced.
Well, in a perfect world, you would be able to serve the tenant with a notice of eviction for non-payment of rent or whatever it is that the tenant is doing that's causing the problem, and be able to proceed to the board, the landlord tenant board, in a timely manner to get a resolution.
Right. But my question is this, because you just said that makes, and trust me. So I should preface this. I don't mean right now with COVID. I understand people have lost jobs and stuff like that. I'm just talking about regular time.
Thank you for saying that.
Where I see this happen constantly. Yeah, but even today, like I know that there's a lot of people who take advantage of this stuff when they could be paying their rent, but because they have the easy out of saying something pandemic related, that end up ruining it for everybody else too. But in a regular times, like to me, if somebody's not paying rent, I still don't see the need to have to go to a tenant board and have people like adjudicate and go, here's my piece of paper. Yep, Dan hasn't paid his rent. You know what? This has taken 2-3 months, but yep, let's sign a document that says Will can now evict me.
Right. So if the tenancy if a tenancy falls under the Residential Tenancies Act and is governed by that act, okay. So and most residential tenancies are, some are not. If it's a roommate situation where the landlord and the tenant are sharing a bathroom or sharing a common space like a kitchen, the Residential Tenancies Act does not apply. It's a different set of laws. However, when the Residential Tenancies Act does apply, the issue is that the tenant and the landlord are supposed to be able to go to the board and state their case, okay? Because the Residential Tenancies Act gives security of tenure to a tenant, the only way a landlord and a tenant, or the only way to dissolve a tenancy or end a tenancy in Ontario, if the tenancy falls under the RTA, is if both parties agree If the tenant gives notice, and if neither of those two apply, then you have to go to the board and have it the matter adjudicated. That's the only way it's to be done. That's the law. And in order to change that, you have to change the law. So in order to do that, you have to talk to your people in the legislation.
Oh, that's just
your legislator.
Well, here's another thing though. So let's just say you are now going to enter into a landlord tenant arrangement.
Okay.
Is there any kind of wording you can add to a document that will outline what could happen if rent is, not paid on time, if utilities are not paid on time, stuff like that? Is there a way around this?
I'm not sure a way around that, but in Ontario, there is a standard lease. In fact, there's a new standard lease coming out, but the standard lease basically outlines the responsibilities as well as refers to the Residential Tenancies Act to state very plainly and very clearly what the responsibilities of each party are. So in the case of a tenant who fails to pay rent, it states that the tenant is supposed to pay rent. If the tenant doesn't pay rent, then the landlord is in a position where the landlord could serve the tenant notice for non-payment of rent. Process goes to the board and will likely result in an eviction. Doesn't always result in an eviction, but it will likely result in an eviction.
Right. Okay. What about, let's discuss other situations then now.
Okay.
So let's just say someone is now buying a property.
Okay.
And said property is on the market. This market's crazy right now, the real estate market. And say in this property, there are tenants that are currently in this home paying rent below market. Because, market rents in Durham have gone up a lot higher than in the other areas. There's no inventory here.
Right.
How does a potentially new landlord who's going to buy this property manage those tenants? One, if they want to remove them, or two, if they want to increase the rent so it's at a level that reflects the market. Okay.
So that's a sort of a two-part question. So
it is.
But I'm prepared. So this is actually a really good question. It was very.
Well, thank you. Word it myself.
The first question, or the first part of the question, is how do you deal with a tenant who is paying below market rent? Okay, and can you raise the rent? Well, the short answer right now, because of COVID, in 2021, a landlord cannot raise the rent. Okay, there is a law that is basically put a pause on increases in rent for 2021, or until the emergency measures or the pandemic has stopped, and that is declared.
Okay.
However, a landlord can increase the, and I'm not going to say rent, kind of say rent. So if a landlord offers a new service to a tenant, they can raise the rent based on the providing of the new service. So, and this is the part that made me I had to think about this. So I'm going to give you a scenario, to make this real. So imagine the property, as you were describing earlier, is a bungalow, or maybe even a triplex. Maybe it's a story house, and there's a main floor, a basement, and a second floor, and they're all separate units. Legal units, assuming.
Right.
Just for this scenario here. Now imagine that they're all paying under market rent. The landlord's been a soft-hearted person. They haven't raised the rent as often as they could, or maybe, whatever. The landlord can't raise the rent this year, maybe in future years, but not this year. However, maybe there is no laundry facility on site. Maybe the current tenants have to go and truck their laundry somewhere else to a laundromat. But maybe there's also space on the property in the residential complex, maybe somewhere down in the basement or a common area, where the landlord could create a space and install a laundry room, a common laundry room. Okay.
Yeah.
So if the landlord were to do that, okay, the landlord could increase the rent based on the value of the new service. Okay.
Okay.
That value is determined by the landlord and the tenant. They could say, the tenant in the basement could say, oh, you know what? I've been trekking my laundry all over the place for weeks or months now, for years now. I would pay another $100 a month if I only had to go around the corner in my, like, inside in my own house or in my own unit, and do my laundry here, instead of having to take a taxi, take a bus, drag it around, have to do it 2 or 3 times a month because I can only carry so much. That might be a huge value to them. Okay. And a landlord and tenant could come to that agreement equally. Okay.
Right.
The landlord could also increase the rent by the amount of money that it costs to cover the utilities to run the washer and dryer. So additional heat and additional hydro, additional water, that kind of stuff could also be added into the rent. And then moving forward, if the landlord has to do a capital improvement, okay, then that can be added in future years, not necessarily this year, but in future years.
Right.
And above the guideline increase, because the landlord has increased the value to the tenants by providing a new service, but the landlord, in order to do that, had to incur a capital expenditure. Okay.
Right.
So now you have an increase in rent based on the actual usage of a new service, an increase in rent based on subjective amount that is of its value based on what the tenant and the landlords both agree to. And you've got a situation where the landlord could possibly have an above the guideline increase that for the capital expenditure of actually installing the laundry area. So that's technically not raising the rent, but it's offering a service which eventually does raise the rent.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So that's an option.
Okay. And then what about the other part of my question, which now I probably have forgotten? When it comes to buying that property with people that are living in there paying below market rent, you said the first part, but how would a new landlord potentially deal with these? My whole question now, I think, is going to surround communication with the new tenants and the landlords to establish some kind of relationship, so there's no confusion. Just how does a landlord, maintain proper communication with their tenants?
Respectfully is probably the easiest way to do that. Talk to the tenants, talk to these people. Like, this is their home, right? It may be the landlord's rental property, it may be their investment, but it's the tenant's home, right?
Right.
So if you approach these people with the position that they deserve just as much respect for in their home as you would in your home, then there's always a middle ground that can be had.
Perfect. And then what about if someone is going to buy said property, tenants are in the property, and then the new owner wants to renovate, do a major renovation, and remove current tenants?
So if a landlord wants to do a major renovation, there is a notice of eviction for that. It's called an N13.
Yeah.
When you serve that to the tenant, the landlord would also have to provide compensation. There's a number of different rules. They're a little bit complex depending on the circumstance. But basically, the landlord has to offer the tenant compensation for moving, or the landlord has to offer another unit satisfactory to the tenant, or the landlord or the tenant will also have the opportunity to come back. It's like first right of refusal to come back to the unit at the original rental rate.
I was going to ask about the rent. So even if there's a major renovation and the space that the tenant lives in is fundamentally different, meaning it's completely new, modernized, completely brand new everything, they can still come back and pay the same rent?
Correct.
Wow.
Correct.
What would happen?
Now, how do you go around that, though? Again, I keep thinking of the landlord. You're going to buy this property at rates that are crazy right now in this market.
Right.
And you're going to go in there. You want to renovate the property to maintain value or increase value. You have tenants that are underpaying rent below market rate.
Right.
You want to go in there and renovate, and then you're going to have them remove themselves for a couple months to come back in a new space at the same level of rent. Or can they then use what you described as like sort of like the whole laundry room example that we gave a few minutes ago, and go, here's a new space. It's fundamentally different. We've invested X. Your new rent will be, $250 more per month.
Right. So I understand what you're saying.
Good.
Unfortunately, putting a new coat of paint on the rental unit, updating the flooring, updating the cupboards, that is not significant enough to qualify for a reason to raise the rent as providing a new service. Okay. The Residential Tenancies Act is very, very specific when it comes to landlords raising the rent and offering new services or providing new amenities in order to increase the rent in that respect. Capital expenditures are looked at very closely and scrutinized as to whether or not they provide a benefit to the tenant or if they're just there as sort of set dressing.
Right. Dan, anything?
Yeah, well, so in a case like, let's say it was in a case like you might have today where you're renovating that house and there's no other places for them to be able to rent because there's nothing available on the market. Would the landlord then have to do something like put them up in a hotel for the duration of that renovation?
Possibly, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
That makes sense to you?
That makes sense to me.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we agree on something then.
Okay, here's another example then that I have, because this is common.
Okay.
Property for sale, tenants in the property.
Yep.
The landlord is going to buy the property. The new landlord is going to buy the property. The buyer is going to buy the property, becoming the new landlord. But this new landlord is going to want to move his family into said property. How do you work that?
Okay, so in this circumstance, once the selling landlord has a firm agreement of purchase and sale, and firm is the key word here, it can't be conditional, it has to be firm. The buyer or purchaser can provide a declaration, and it's basically a statement that says that the new buyer needs the property for the buyer's own use. Okay.
Right.
And what that means is that they're going to move in there with their family or their mother, their father, their spouse, their son, their daughter, that kind of situation. It can't be their second cousin on their mom's side once removed. It's got to be a little bit more closer than that. Okay. Or for the purpose of having a caregiver that is live in to look after one of those people in that immediate circle. Okay.
Right.
So once the deal is firm and once the buyer provides the selling landlord with that declaration, the selling landlord is allowed to then provide serve the tenants an N12 notice for purchaser's own use.
Right. And then now this whole, keys for cash thing, I've heard is a thing that's popular with these situations.
Yes.
Where people that are selling their homes are making an exorbitant amount of money on their properties. And so I would assume the current owner of said home that just sold would, how would the seller work out an arrangement with the current tenant to ensure that tenant moves out on closing?
Okay. So the way that it generally, and this is sort of a superficial sort of look at this, Generally, cash for keys situation comes into effect when a landlord wants more control, more predictability over the situation, and wants to try and guarantee vacant possession for this incoming new buyer or new purchaser. The idea is that the selling landlord wants to entice the tenant into signing consent to relinquish their occupancy rights of the premises. Okay.
Right.
Ideally, what you want them to sign is something called an N11, which is an agreement to end a tenancy. Okay. The reason you want them to sign that document, and that's key, is because if the tenant decides that they don't want to go through with the deal, then the landlord has a way to get the tenant out. The recourse is that the landlord will then file an application at the board, okay, for an eviction because the tenant failed to uphold their end of the agreement, okay, and that's pretty important. And the board usually does those on an expedited circumstance. So a couple of weeks, maybe 2 or 3, 4. I've recently heard that they're taking less than 2 months to get to. Okay, so this is a good thing. That's a good thing.
You say.
In the grand scheme of things, 2 months is a lot better than 9 months. So I'm gonna go with that. Okay. But there's still some things that that probably should be done in order to get the parties to agree, because there's no reason for a tenant to actually agree to sign the N11. They can take the N12 for purchaser's own use and wait for a hearing, because the tenant is allowed by right to wait for a hearing to make sure that the landlord is giving them this notice in good faith. Problem is that a lot of landlords in the past have done this without good faith. So there's
so then how do you, so if you're about to sell your home then, so I guess before your home hits the market, if you have tenants in there, it would make sense for you to have all these details worked out now before. Okay. All right. That makes sense. Yes, that does make sense, because I think the wild card would be the tenant. Even if you're going to give them, money or whatever, you got to ensure that there's some kind of legal document outside of the N11 or 12, whatever.
Yes.
That's signed either by a lawyer, paralegal, or whatever, that works out the arrangement between the current tenant and the current landlord to ensure they vacate on or while before closing.
Correct. And if this sort of a situation is approached early enough in the process of a landlord looking to sell their property, then it's very likely that an agreement can be made in a timely manner that will allow the landlord to then take vacant possession of the property and do all those wonderful things, or allow the realtor to take control and do all those wonderful things that allows the seller to get top dollar for the property. Maybe it's a coat of paint. Maybe it's freshening up some of the decor. Maybe it's fixing up some things that really need some maintenance and haven't been looked at for a long time. All of those things can be taken into consideration, as well as staging. I know how important staging is for a property, especially when it is vacant. You want to make sure it looks homey and looks ready for the next person to come in and bring their stuff and so they can see how they fit into this space. So if a landlord and a tenant can come to an agreement such as cash for keys in advance of selling the property and marketing the property, then it puts the selling landlord in a better position to market the property. The flip side of that, though, the benefit to the tenant is that usually the tenant comes out with a bit of a financial windfall. Right. So, and depending on the circumstance, I've had landlords offer 2 or 3 months rent. I've had landlords who offer credits towards rent in advance. I've seen landlords offer
you said something that's interesting. Credits in advance, meaning what?
So A landlord will, or I will often advise my landlord clients, okay, for a month's rent free, or a credit towards a month's rent in advance, and then a cash payout after the landlord receives the keys and confirms that the property is vacant and there's no none of the tenant's personal property is still in the space. So the landlord is offering value, but not necessarily out of pocket cash.
Right.
Right. So it's sort of a way to sort of limit some of the liability in case things go south, but also limit how much money the landlord is going to have to physically hand over at the end of the deal. So I've seen credits towards rent in advance. So as an example, if I had somebody that came to me today and said, Denise, I want you to write, offer my tenant a cash for keys deal, give them a credit of 1 month's rent, and then we're going to give them some money when everything is done. I'd say, great. So we're already into February. So February's rent is already paid, most likely, right? So I would suggest or advise the credit goes to March's rent. Last month's rent is April, and that's already on file, right? So that at the end of April is when the tenancy or the proposal for the tenancy would be to end then. Right. And then once the keys are handed over, then the landlord can provide the tenant with a one-time final payout of X, whatever that is.
Right. And so that's kind of the word you would have either in the document, the lease document, or a separate document that's lawyered.
It would be in a separate document. I refer to it as a cash for keys agreement. And there's usually something called an addendum that is added and signed at the very end. So the agreement is entered into at the same time that an N11 is signed. Those two things together form the agreement. And then there's a waiting period for the time for the tenant to vacate, or, pack up and get ready to move. Then the termination date, which is the last day that the tenant is in the unit. And then on that day, the landlord and the tenant either meet individually or with a property manager or third party, and confirm that each party, or more specifically, the tenant, has upheld their end of the deal and fulfilled all the terms and conditions in the agreement in order to get the payout.
Right. And the payout is basically they're getting a check from the landlord for 1 month's rent to be. And again, if there's any damage, does money come out that are typically the landlord is supposed to get rid of that person and say, you know what, have fun?
Yeah. So one of the things that I suggest or advise my clients of is that if they're entering into this kind of an agreement with the tenant, then to shortly after the agreement has been signed, to go in and do an inspection of the property just to get a baseline of what the current state of the property is. So if there's any damage, what wear and tear is currently involved with in the property, so that when you go back to do the final walkthrough, whether or not that that nick on the wall has been there for 2 years, or if it's fresh and brand new, or if that hole in the wall over there, or that door was broken, that door's been broken for 2 years, it's okay, we know about it, it's not new damage. What you're looking for is new undue damage that hasn't been resolved in advance, that may cause the tenant to lose out on that final payout.
Perfect. Dan, anything?
Not on that topic. I have another question that's in my head, though, because someone asked me the other day.
Okay.
So now that we're in this wonderful pandemic, what happens if something occurs that ends up screwing both sides over and they can't wait that 2-3 months to get into the tenant review board? So for example, let's say the tenant really does lose their job or is severely impacted and really can't pay the rent.
Right.
But the landlord is also so up against it that if that tenant hasn't paid the rent for 2 or 3 months, they're now behind on the mortgage and won't be able to pay it.
Right.
And so instead of, let's say, foreclosing at the bank because they can't pay the mortgage, and let's say the bank doesn't want to necessarily work with them on extending the mortgage, and they decide that they have to sell the house, what happens then? Because you've got a tenant who can't pay the rent, then you've got the landlord who can't pay the mortgage. What legalities are there that govern that type of a situation?
I'm not sure how to answer that question, I'll be honest, because we've never been here before. We've never had a pandemic at the same time as having a Residential Tenancies Act. And so this is all new. It's troublesome. It's absolutely troublesome. And by smiling, I don't mean to belittle this subject.
Oh, no, not at all. Same here.
It's very serious. It's unfortunate. And I recognize that there are a lot of tenants and a lot of landlords out there that are struggling. I don't know what to say other than for those people to communicate as best as they can with each other. There is a requirement for a landlord to attempt to at least enter into a payment plan with a tenant who can't pay the rent, maybe in full, but maybe be able to pay in part. Given the circumstance that, or the scenario that you provided, I'm not sure if that would be reasonable. The question then comes down to what resources are available to these people, and can they come to any sort of an agreement? I don't know. And that's also maybe a little bit beyond my scope as a paralegal. At that point, I would strongly suggest that the landlord contacts maybe an accountant to talk about what their options are with regards to refinancing, or sorry, not an accountant, a mortgage broker, maybe even an accountant.
Yeah. Okay.
Talk about their financial options to see how they can extend themselves. Not to put the whole burden on the landlord, but that is one option that they may have. And to try and just work with the tenant. I can't stress that enough. I mean, I don't know what sort of situation each tenant is. A lot of people are in, minimum wage circumstance jobs. I don't know whether or not everybody is going to qualify for EI or I know CERB has run out. Things are going to get difficult for a lot of people, and I think people just have to be honest and patient as best they can, and work with the people that are around them. I wish I had a better answer. I really do.
So, but your answer essentially is that if a landlord is in a tough situation, and so is said tenant, that they need to communicate to one another, yes, and be honest with each other. And then the landlord needs to be pretty honest about the ramifications of non-payment.
Yes.
And the tenant essentially needs to be understanding. Someone could try to fight it, but facts are facts. If you can't pay it, the banks will come for the house. You either lose the house or you sell it. Those are the options that you have typically.
Correct. And as a tenant, I'm sure that there are a lot of people out there that they are feeling the pinch. Their back's against the wall. They're not working because their industry is shut down because of the pandemic. Hopefully things will open up soon. But it is going to be a bit of a nail biter in waiting for things to sort of finally open up. And I know people are getting antsy, and I know people are getting, they're struggling. But I think the best thing for a landlord to do in this circumstance is to be very honest, and respectful too, right? It's that position where, as a landlord, I know that if finances are tight, people get their backs up, and people get wound up, and people get worried, and people get nervous, and that comes through in conversation, and trying to keep the idea of being respectful sort of at the forefront will maybe help to try and at least have those conversations that are difficult with a tenant, so that all parties understand what's going on, rather than say, hey, I'm selling the house next week so you're going to have to move, and then people get worried and their backs get up.
Right. No, Dan, that was a good question, actually, surprisingly.
Good question. Once in a while,
Oh,
Well, I mean,
man. I'm on your side on this one.
Well, it's hard to it's hard to get a word in when Will gets on a roll, so you just gotta kind of sit back and.
Well, this is such an important topic right now because I see so many people, as we've been saying, struggling in this very weird and prolonged, it seems, time. And so I think it's important that landlords understand that if you're going to go into a leasing or a tenancy agreement, that maybe it might make sense to contact, ranger.legal and go and sort of sit down and work. It's that small fee it's a small fee when you think about the long-term impact of not having a lease agreement that reflects what's happening around us or what could come down the road as a result of this. So I think that's a very good point there, Denise. And I am done with my questions because we've gone for like almost an hour here, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Anything else to add, Denise?
There was one question that you posed to me that you sent me in advance that you wanted me to sort of touch on about things that a landlord could put in a lease that kind of has some teeth.
Yes.
And so I just want to address that a little bit. So in order for any term or condition that is added to a lease to have any effect or any teeth, as you express it, it has to comply with the Residential Tenancies Act. So my advice would be for a new landlord or even a long-term landlord, a seasoned landlord, is to become familiar with the act. The law is dynamic, it's always changing. And even just as recent as earlier this summer in I think it was July of 2020, there were new provisions that came into the Residential Tenancies Act. Some were enabled almost immediately. Others have yet to be proclaimed. Some of those provisions are going to have significant impact on the rights of both a landlord and a tenant. I think it balances them out a little bit more going forward. It allows the landlord to go to the board for issues that they weren't previously allowed to do. But what I will leave you with, if you've got a moment, is a couple of terms that I've seen in your, what do you call it? The AREA Form 400 Schedule A to an agreement to lease.
Yep.
Probably, and this is a real lease. This is a real agreement to lease. I'm going to hold it up here. I don't know if you can see that, but it's a real lease.
I can.
Not a fake document. And this is probably the worst I've ever seen. The reason being is that the first line of the agreement says that the tenant and the landlord agree that an accepted agreement to lease shall form a complete lease and no other lease will be signed between the parties. That's contracting out of the Residential Tenancies Act and is, because it's attempting to contract out, it's void. So any term or condition in a lease or an agreement to lease that contradicts the Residential Tenancies Act is going to be void or unenforceable. So as a realtor, one of the things that you should be looking, I would suggest that you look at, is making sure that these terms and conditions are not voidable, and that's the best way to protect your landlord clients.
Okay, perfect. That's great.
Okay, I could do a whole seminar.
Oh no, you can, but I know, but we've been going like an hour here, and honestly, great information. Thank you, Dan. Do you have anything else to add? I don't want to be accused of not allowing you to speak a little bit more.
No, I'm good. I got some things off my chest. I feel a little better.
But the reality is that the reality is though is that landlords and tenants need to be prepared, and us as agents, I'm an agent, and we need to ensure that we have agreements that support the Landlord Tenant Act, whatever it's called, the act, but also ensure that there's open communication between the landlord and tenant throughout the entire process leading up to a signed and firm offer.
See,
I think that's important as well.
I do have something.
There we go.
It just popped in. See, and as you said that, I think one of my biggest problems with this whole area of law is I don't think it does enough to distinguish between the different types of landlords. Like there's a major difference between, like, let's say Valiant Property Management Inc. and Will Ellis, who owns a house and rents it out to some people, right? And that I think needs to be more clarified, and there needs to be some different rules, because sure, a major corporation like that, there should be some extra protections in place for the tenant, and they can withstand going 3, 4, 5 months and having things stretched out through a board. But somebody who's just an individual owner who might own 1 or 2 little rental properties, they don't have the same financial backing. They can't have these laws that are in place that put everything in the tenant's hand and make it impossible for them to switch them over, because they won't be able to survive.
You are absolutely right.
By the way, Will, that's my 3rd absolutely right today, and I haven't seen you get one.
Well, good for you. Congrats. Congratulations.
There you go.
That is true, though. Actually, that's a good point.
You got a hat trick of rights.
That's it.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. So again, thank you, Denise. Anything else to add, Dad? No, good thing. So again, I'll give your information again, Denise. Great resource available on Facebook at Ranger Paralegal. Your website is ranger.legal. And you are the founder of Ranger Paralegal Service. Your phone number is 905-240-7529. Thank you so much. You are a wealth of knowledge. And and thank you so much. And again, if anyone has any questions, again, you guys are pretty responsive on your Facebook page. It's a new page. Yes. Already over 200 likes. What do you guys? Is that crazy?
I'm so excited.
Yes, well, I think I don't know how many I have. I don't think I have that many likes on my page. Dan, how many likes do you have on your page?
Oh, maybe 2.
Okay, I'm going to go to your page and I'm going to like your page, Dan, because you're awesome today.
Denise, I wouldn't even worry about it. I don't even go to my page.
Your page is Profit by Intention, right, Dan?
Yep.
So there you go. So you can go to his page and like his page, Denise and everyone. My page is Agent Will Ellis, and I'm constantly posting things this year, it seems. And again, Denise, thank you so much, and everyone have a wonderful day.
Thanks a lot.